Welcome to Enigma of the Unknown. Tonight, we're diving into the dark heart of the wilderness, where the line between reality and nightmare blurs. Imagine you're out camping under the stars, surrounded by the quiet rustle of trees, only to discover you're not as alone as you thought. These are real-life camping horror stories that will make you think twice before your next adventure in the great outdoors. Ready for chills? Let's get started. Story number 1. A camping nightmare. Ethan, I heard my mom shout from downstairs. It's time to get up. We gotta go. I tossed and turned in bed, groggy with just barely enough energy to lift my eyelids a sliver. Daylight poured through my bedroom window and reflexively made me shut my eyes again. Ethan, we need to go. Now. My mom shouted more emphatically this time. Coming. I hollered back as I rolled out of bed and trekked to the bathroom. I grabbed my toothbrush and squirted some toothpaste on the end. As I brushed, I looked at myself in the mirror. I looked like a real mess. Hair going every which way, eyes barely open and crusted on both sides. I stumbled over to the shower and got the water started. What was the point of showering the day of camp anyway? I'd just get all gross anyway. I quickly finished my shower, threw some clothes on, and ran downstairs. We're going to be so late. I hope they don't leave without you, my mom said in a disapproving tone. The car's packed. We just need to go. Okay, I said as I hurried out the door to the car. 7:59 a.m. We got to my school just in time. My mom yelled goodbye and love you out the window as I sprinted to the chaperone of my group. Ethan, you sure know how to make loading a bus suspenseful. Mrs. Twinkle grumbled as she peered over her glasses at me. I hopped on the bus and sat next to my friend Dave, who was still saving a seat for me with his backpack. Knowing I'd be late, the 3-hour bus ride was uneventful and flew by as Dave and I talked about what the next 2 weeks would be like. Every summer since we were in first grade, we'd gone on this camping trip together. This year, though, we'd have more freedom to do the activities we wanted, mostly on our own too. Pulling up to Camp Widowee felt more nostalgic every year. The smell of pine trees, the sound of rushing rivers, all the memories of past summers came flooding back. We unloaded the bus and carried our bags to the cabins. The boys all slept in 2 large cabins on the one side of the dusty dirt path leading through the campgrounds. The girls had 2 cabins on the other side. Dave and I headed into our cabin along with a bunch of the other guys. Dave and I claimed our usual bunk and threw our bags on the beds. After everyone grabbed a bed, we all lined up outside for the introduction and safety talk. I've heard this talk so many times. I could give it myself. Blah blah buddy system, blah blah fire safety. New summer. Same lame speech. I looked around at the other guys. They looked bored as hell, too. All the usual guys were there. Austin, Tyler, Mason. We'd grown close over the years. Tommy, Zach, Kevin. We'd had so many fun times here. Jack, Jesse, and the new kid in school, Lucas. I heard he just moved here last month from somewhere down south. He seemed like a nice enough guy. After the long spiel, we all got together to catch up. It had only been 2 weeks since school let out, but we still felt like we needed to fill each other in on any recent events. Our lives as junior high schoolers were fast-paced. You know, I could tell Lucas felt a bit out of place, so I cut into the rapid-fire discussion. Hey, you're Lucas, right? I said to try to get him into the conversation. Lucas looked over at me as everyone else grew silent. His eyes were an icy, electric blue that almost seemed to glow as I looked into them. They were the most mesmerizing eyes I'd ever seen. Lucas smiled at everyone and introduced himself. Yeah, I'm Lucas. My friends back home call me Luke. I know I don't really know you guys, and you don't know me, but I was hoping this trip would help me make some friends before school starts, he said, his voice growing more confident as he spoke. Everyone peppered Luke with questions. Where are you from? What's it like there? Are the girls really hotter? What do you like to do? Luke happy answered all the questions we threw at him. We went to the mess hall for lunch and continued talking and getting to know Luke. After lunch, We headed back to our cabins to get changed for our first hike. Luke had the bunk right across from mine. We chatted for a bit before heading outside to join the group. The hike was incredible. We reached the top of the mountain just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. What a gorgeous view. We started a fire and roasted marshmallows before heading back down the mountain. Everyone had their flashlights and headlamps on. Our one leader led the way while the other took up the rear. We were about halfway down when I heard it. Someone from our group screamed at the top of their lungs in agony. We all looked around as our leaders rushed toward the scream. Being curious and scared kids, we followed our leaders to Jack. He was lying on the ground with 2 puncture wounds in his left leg, right above his ankle. Luke was sitting beside him trying to keep him calm. Jack's wound started to swell and redden as we watched our leaders care for him. What happened? Our one leader asked Jack. I don't know. I stepped off a rock, then felt a sharp pain, like a bite, Jack said shakily. Luke chimed in. I think I saw a snake slither by after he screamed. Did you see what kind? The other leader asked. I don't really know. It was black and red. Maybe some yellow. Luke answered. Crap, that might be poisonous. Let's get him down and to a hospital. The other leader said. The leaders lifted Jack up and carried him down the rest of the way. When we reached the bottom, an ambulance was waiting for Jack. Of all those hikes we'd done in the past, we never had a snake encounter. I didn't even know that mountain had snakes. As we turned in for the night, we were all worried about Jack. It was tough to fall asleep, so we all stayed up talking and joking. Zach and Jesse wanted to start a truth or dare game, so that helped us get through an hour or two before we heard a knock on our cabin. That startled us. It was after 11 p.m. according to my watch. The door creaked open. Our leader came in looking exhausted. I have some news on Jack. First off, he's going to be fine. They gave him some anti-venom at the hospital. Luke's description helped a lot. I'm told Jack should be back in a day or two. Our leader rambled off. I gotta say, first snake bite I've seen in those mountains. But glad he's gonna be okay. Hopefully you boys can get some rest. With that, he exited our cabin, closing the door behind him. Aside from that crazy night, the first week was uneventful. We did everything from archery to fishing. It was the second week that was unusual to say the least. Monday night, my friends Kevin and Mason talked about going for a sunrise hike and asked if I wanted to join them. I was feeling more in the mood to kayak that day, so I declined their offer. Luke said he'd go with them though. I spent the day on the lake kayaking with a few other guys and girls. We headed back to the shore just before dinner. We walked as a group to the mess hall, ready for a well-deserved dinner. When we walked in, everyone seemed to be in a frenzy. Everyone was talking about something. Was it Jack? He was back already. That wasn't it. I sat down and asked someone what was going on. You haven't heard? Kevin slipped and fell off the mountaintop. He must have stepped on a loose rock or something, but he went over the side and landed on a ledge like 10 or 15 feet below. Thank God for that too, or else. Well, you know, he paused. They took him away like an hour ago. Surprised you didn't see the flashing lights. I sat there stunned. Camp was always fun, but painfully uneventful. Well, except for the occasional pranks and crazy truth or dare games. Nothing like this ever happened before. How'd he get down? From the mountain, I blurted out. Well, Mason was way ahead of them. He said he heard someone shouting for help and ran back. Luke was already lowering himself down to the ledge on a rope that I guess he packed. He recounted. I was a little confused, but let him continue. Mason says Luke lifted Kevin onto his shoulder and climbed back up where they waited for help. I thanked him for filling me in and got up to get some food. Meatloaf tonight. Not my favorite, but I wasn't exactly hungry anymore. I grabbed my tray and looked around the mess hall. I caught Luke's eyes from a distance and saw a group gathered around him, presumably trying to get all the details. Luke rolled his eyes as people continued to crowd around him. I walked over and joined them, making my way through the crowd. I set my tray down next to Luke and tapped him on the shoulder. "Wanna get out of here?" I asked him, without saying a word. He got up and started walking toward the door with me. Thankfully, no one followed us outside. "So I guess you heard by now too?" Luke asked with a half smile. "I heard parts of it," I said with a half chuckle. "You sound like a hero." "Man, I'm hardly a hero. Just right place at the right time," he said as he shrugged. "I'm just glad I was there and could help." Our leader came running up the path. We asked what was going on and he stopped in front of us. Out of breath, he said, "Mess hall. I'll explain." We went back inside after him. He got up on one of the tables, cupped his hands around his mouth, and yelled, "Hey, everyone, listen up." The mess hall gradually simmered down. He waited to catch his breath before continuing. "A lot of you asked about what happened today on the mountain. We just heard from the hospital. Kevin is fine. He'll need back surgery, but he's stable and in good spirits." He took a breath, then went on. "Please, everyone, pay attention to your surroundings. Be cautious and safe. We're only here for a few more days. Let's make the best of them." He climbed off the table and left the mess hall. Almost immediately, the hall erupted in talks about Kevin again. Luke and I went back to the cabin and talked more about Kevin, which then evolved into answering questions about and giving tips for the upcoming school year. A little while later, the rest of the guys returned and we all got ready for bed. Tomorrow I would be going fishing. I was so excited for a super relaxing, chill day. The next morning, a few of us headed out to the lake with our rods, tackle, and bait. We set up our gear and cast off, then sat back and waited for a bite. All of us took turns saying what we were most excited for in junior high. A few of us had good catches. We spent all day fishing. The time flew by. We packed up everything and made our way back to the cabin. We showed off our catches to our friends, then put them back on ice. They'd make a good dinner for sure. That night, we sat around a huge bonfire and sang together. Luke on my one side, Austin on the other, even that SpongeBob song. We were all happy and enjoying the night. We locked arms and sang, "Let there be peace on earth." This wasn't a Christian or religious camp or anything, but we were all from the same Catholic high school. Why we chose that song, I don't know. Maybe it was our way of praying for our injured friends. While singing, I looked around and everyone had the biggest smiles on their faces. I didn't see Luke's face, and I didn't hear him singing either. That's no big deal. Lots of people at our school weren't religious or even Christian. After a few more songs, we grabbed some marshmallows and sticks and stuck them in the fire. S'mores night was always my favorite night. What could beat dessert, a nice fire, and good friends? Austin and I were engaged in a heated debate about the most effective way to get a girl's attention. When I heard someone yell, "Not again," I thought. My eyes darted toward what looked like flaming arm flapping back and forth. Tyler's arm was on fire. He dropped to the ground and rolled around just like the classic phrase said. After successfully extinguishing his arm, Tyler got up and examined the damage. He had really bad burns all the way from his hand to his mid-bicep. The leaders called for an ambulance and iced his arm. Most of the guys were in shock. My mind was racing. What was going on? That night I barely slept, and from what I could tell, that was the case for most of the guys. Seeing our friend's arm on fire and then the burns, that was almost unbearable. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because I woke up to the sound of sirens. I checked my phone, 5:17 a.m. I remember that time exactly, because what followed was impossible to forget. All of us sprinted out of our cabin. We gathered between the 4 cabins on the dirt path. There was much noise and chatter and commotion. I didn't know where to look or what to think. 6 EMTs made their way by us with gurneys, heading toward the lake. We all waited and kept speculating about what was going on. After what felt like an eternity, the EMTs came back hastily with full gurneys. From the looks of it, all 3 guys were unconscious. 2 had bandages wrapped around their heads. All of them had collars around their necks. Our leaders came by shaking their heads. I'm not sure who it was, but one of them started speaking. "It looks like some of your friends decided to go for a night swim. Well, more like night dive. They hit their heads and have to go to the hospital, since we'd all seen them get wheeled by. The shock value here was considerably less. Our leader continued, but on a brighter note, Tyler is doing well. He paused again. So, that's where we are. He and the other leader went back to their cabin. We returned to our two. Head injuries are serious, and things didn't look too great. I climbed into bed and checked my phone. It was just before 6 a.m. when I decided to text Tyler and see how he was feeling. I didn't expect a response since it was so early, so I put my phone away and lay down. Next thing I knew, it was bright and early in the morning. I was only half awake and checked my phone. Tyler responded. He said he was feeling much better and his arm was totally bandaged up. I asked if he wanted to talk about what happened or if he remembered anything about it. Tyler texted me a huge paragraph. The general gist of it was the fire shot out at him. He claimed he was the same distance as all of us from the fire. There was no wind. How the fire got to him was anyone's guess. Interestingly, Tyler mentioned Luke was next to him when it happened. He remembered feeling Luke push him back before the fire shot him. If it weren't for Luke, Tyler would have had burns all over his torso and face for sure. We exchanged a few more texts before I had to run to breakfast. After the week we had, I was really looking forward to enjoying our last day of camp. I just wanted to take it easy swimming and kayaking, two of my favorite activities. Back at the cabin, I changed into my swimsuit. I checked my phone again. Tyler texted me a few times. The texts talked about how he remembered Luke saying something like, "Not yet," before he pushed him away. Not yet. What did he mean? What did he know? How did he know? I stopped myself. What was I thinking? This was obviously nothing. Nonetheless, I decided to text Kevin and ask if he remembered anything else about his fall. Then I headed back out in my kayak. The sky was free of clouds. The rays of sunlight felt warm as they gradually tanned my skin. I felt so at peace on the water. I decided to paddle back to shore after what I estimated to be 2 hours. I checked my phone again. Kevin's texts flashed on my screen. His texts were rather unenlightening, with the exception of one. He mentioned that before he fell, he thought he heard a voice say something, which he thinks might have spooked him enough to knock him off balance. After digging deeper, he recalled hearing the words, "Not yet." I dropped my phone and froze. This was far too odd to just be a coincidence. My mind jumped from thought to thought, none of them particularly good. I tried to clear my mind and relax by cleaning myself up and grabbing some food. I couldn't stop running through the different scenarios. After chatting with some people about unrelated things, I started to feel better. I left the mess hall with some of the guys and we all jumped in our beds to chill together one last time before heading home tomorrow. Looking down to check my phone, I saw it was after 10 p.m. already. This day really went by too fast. As much fun as I had and as crazy as this trip was, I was excited to go back home and sleep in my own bed. Around midnight, we all officially hit the sack. I barely thought about anything at all. Sweet dreams, here we come. Something woke me. Was it a noise? A nightmare? No, neither. My arms and legs felt heavy, almost sunken into the bed. I felt like I couldn't move. I could feel my heart rate accelerating as I tried to sit up, but couldn't. I tried to open my eyes, and finally they flipped open. Probably should have kept them closed. There, standing over me in bed with his icy blue eyes piercing my soul and his sinister grin spreading from ear to ear. You, I thought. Of course it was you. My heart was pounding through my chest as I laid there, paralyzed by fear or something worse. After what felt like an agonizing eternity, Luke spoke. He whispered in a voice that sounded like icicles shattering on the sidewalk. Not yet. I watched helplessly as he reached over me and placed his hand on my chest. In that moment, felt like an 18-wheeler slammed into my chest. I swear my heart stopped. I shot up in bed screaming as I opened my eyes. My heart was racing. I was covered in sweat. I mustered some courage and looked around. I was alone. This was my room. I clawed around my bed for my phone. 3:33 a.m. I did a double take at the date, December 13th. I turned all the lights on in my room and sat up trying to figure everything out. I must have been up for hours by the time I heard my mom call up the stairs. "Ethan, breakfast." I slowly made my way down the steps and lit up when I saw my mom in the kitchen. I raced around the counter and gave her a massive bear hug. "What in the world is that for?" she asked. "I'm not complaining about you hugging your mom though. I'm just so happy to see you," I blurted out. "Well, okay then. I'll take a hug for any reason," she said, smiling. I let go and went to grab some orange juice from the fridge. As I closed the door, I noticed my mom hung some Christmas cards on there. It made me ecstatic to see my friends and their families on there. Mixed in were some funeral cards. I checked the names Jack, Kevin, and Tyler. I started feeling lightheaded and dizzy. I sat down at the table for a second and quickly Googled my friends' names. I found the news articles right away. All three of them died in a car accident at 3 a.m. on a back road just 2 weeks ago. It was a one-car accident. No other cars involved. No survivors. Authorities think the car swerved into the median after hitting a patch of black ice while traveling at a high rate of speed. Images of the wreck were hard to look at. The whole front of the car was completely compressed and the entire car erupted in flames. My friends died and I wasn't even aware? How could this be? I got up for my second attempt at getting orange juice. Just by the ice maker, one Christmas card jumped out at me. I froze. There in the center of the card were two icy blue eyes staring back at me. At the bottom the card read, "Happy Holidays, from Crystal, Damien, and Luke D. Morty." I could feel my chest tighten and my pulse quicken, but I managed to string together a mumbled, Who sent this?" My mom looked at me sideways, obviously confused. She replied, "That's that guy you met at summer camp last summer. Silly. He moved here just before that and ever since you two have been inseparable. You trying to quiz me on your friends?" She laughed. However, was not laughing. I was petrified. I searched through my texts. Then I found it. A convo with Luke that I don't recall ever starting. 9:42 p.m. yesterday. The last message I sent him, "Hey, you ready to go to the movies?" 9:44 p.m. His last message, "Not yet." Story number 2. After this weekend, I will never go camping again. I never should have come on this stupid camping trip. That's what I kept telling myself as I huddled in the damp darkness, straining my ears for any sound that might give away the presence of what? I didn't even know anymore. All I knew was that something was out there in the endless sea of pines. Something that had already taken Eric's dad, and now it was hunting us. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I should start at the beginning, back when this was just supposed to be a fun weekend getaway with my friends. God, was that really only 2 days ago? Feels like a lifetime. My name's Charlie, and I'm in 8th grade at Millbrook Middle School. Just your average 13-year-old kid, I guess. Not particularly athletic or popular, but I've got a solid group of friends. That's who I was with when everything went to hell. Eric, Peter, Jason, and Robert. Eric had been going on and on about this camping trip for weeks. His dad, Mr. Larson, was some kind of outdoorsman and had promised to take Eric and a few friends deep into the Adirondacks for a real wilderness experience. No cell phones, no iPads, just good old-fashioned camping. Eric was practically bouncing off the walls with excitement. "Come on, Charlie. It'll be awesome," he'd said, grinning from ear to ear. "My dad's gonna teach us how to track animals, build shelters, all that survival stuff." I'd been hesitant at first. The thought of being out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by who knows what, didn't exactly fill me with enthusiasm. But peer pressure is a hell of a thing, and eventually caved. So there we were, piled into Mr. Larson's massive SUV early on a crisp Friday morning in October. The leaves were just starting to turn, painting the world in a riot of reds and golds. It should have been beautiful. Instead, as we drove deeper and deeper into the wilderness, leaving civilization far behind. I felt a growing sense of unease settling in the pit of my stomach. I glanced around at my friends, wondering if any of them felt the same. Eric, of course, was practically vibrating with excitement, his mop of blonde hair bouncing as he pointed out landmarks to his dad. He'd always been the adventurous one of our group, always pushing us to try new things, take risks. Sometimes it led to amazing experiences. Other times, well, let's just say Eric's ideas didn't always pan out. Next to Eric sat Peter, his nose buried in a thick paperback. Classic Peter. While the rest of us were busy with sports or video games, Peter devoured books like they were going out of style. He pushed his glasses up his nose and flipped another page, completely oblivious to the world around him. In the back row with me were Jason and Robert. Jason was sound asleep, his bulky frame taking up more than his fair share of the seat. The gentle giant of our group. Jason was the kind of guy who could bench press a small car but wouldn't hurt a fly. His snores filled the car, providing an oddly comforting background noise. Robert, on the other hand, was wide awake, his dark eyes darting nervously from window to window. Out of all of us, Robert was the one I was most surprised to see on this trip. He wasn't exactly the outdoorsy type, more of a computer geek, really, always talking about coding and AI and stuff I barely understood. But here he was, clutching his backpack like a lifeline. "You okay, Rob?" I whispered, not wanting to wake Jason or interrupt Mr. Larson's running commentary on the local flora and fauna. Robert jumped slightly, then gave me a weak smile. "Yeah, just not used to all this nature. You know, it's so big." I nodded, understanding completely. The farther we drove, the smaller I felt, like we were being swallowed up by the vast, indifferent wilderness. After what felt like hours, Mr. Larson finally pulled off onto a barely visible dirt road. We bounced and jolted along for another 20 minutes before he brought the car to a stop in a small clearing. "All right, boys," he boomed, his voice filled with enthusiasm. "This is where our real adventure begins. Grab your packs. We've got about a 5-mile hike to our campsite." 5 miles? Through this dense forest? I exchanged a worried glance with Robert, but there was no backing out now. We piled out of the car, shouldering our heavy backpacks. Mr. Larson led the way, machete in hand to clear any obstacles. With Eric right on his heels, the rest of us fell into line behind them, with me bringing up the rear. As we hiked, the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees grew taller, their branches intertwining overhead to block out most of the sunlight. The air grew cooler, damper. Strange bird calls echoed in the distance, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. But it wasn't until we were about halfway to the campsite that I first noticed something was off. It was subtle at first, just a feeling of being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something lurking in the shadows between the trees. But there was never anything there, just more trees, stretching endlessly in every direction. Then I started to notice the silence fell suddenly, like someone had flipped a switch. One moment, the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and small animals. The next, nothing, just the crunch of our boots on the leaf-strewn ground and our labored breathing. I wasn't the only one who noticed. I saw Robert's head swiveling back and forth, his eyes wide with fear. Even Jason, usually so laid back, seemed on edge. "Hey, Mr. Larson," Peter called out, his voice unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Is it normal for the forest to get this quiet?" Mr. Larson paused, frowning slightly. "Well, sometimes animals will go quiet if there's a predator in the area. Bear, maybe, or a mountain lion. Nothing to worry about. Boys, they're more afraid of us than we are of them." His words were meant to be reassuring, but they had the opposite effect on me. A bear? A mountain lion? How was that supposed to make us feel better? We pressed on, the silence growing heavier with each step. And then, just as the last of the daylight was fading, We heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold and my heart leap into my throat. It was a scream, high-pitched, agonized, and very, very human. Mr. Larson froze, his hand flying up in a gesture for us to stop. "What the hell was that?" he muttered, more to himself than to us. "Dad!" Eric's voice was small, scared. I'd never heard him sound like that before. "Dad, what do we do?" For a long moment, Mr. Larson didn't move. Then he seemed to shake himself, turning to face us with a forced smile. "It's probably nothing, boys. Maybe some animal that sounds like a person. But just to be safe, we're gonna set up camp right here for the night. Okay?" We nodded mutely, too scared to argue. As we started to unpack our gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were making a terrible mistake. We should have turned back, should have run as fast as we could back to the car and civilization. But we didn't, and as the night closed in around us, bringing with it a chorus of unnatural sounds and fleeting shadows just beyond the reach of our flashlights, I realized with growing horror that it might already be too late. We set up camp in a small clearing, our tents forming a tight circle around the fire pit Mr. Larson insisted on building. "Fire keeps the animals away," he said, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had made that scream wasn't afraid of a little campfire. As the flames flickered to life, casting long shadows across our faces, I studied my friends. Eric was trying to put on a brave face, but I could see the fear in his eyes. Peter had his nose in his book again, but he wasn't turning any pages. Jason sat on a log, his massive frame hunched over, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. And Robert was muttering to himself, fingers flying over the screen of a small device he'd pulled from his pocket. "Hey!" Mr. Larson's sharp voice made us all jump. "I thought I said no electronics. Robert, hand it over." Robert clutched the device to his chest, his eyes wide. "But Mr. Larson, no buts. This is about experiencing nature. Remember? Now give it here." Reluctantly, Robert surrendered the gadget. Mr. Larson pocketed it with a satisfied nod. "All right, boys, who wants to learn how to roast the perfect marshmallow?" But none of us were in the mood for campfire treats. The forest around us seemed alive with whispers and movement, just beyond the reach of the firelight. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent a fresh jolt of fear through me. "Mr. Larson," I finally worked up the courage to ask, What if that scream wasn't an animal? Shouldn't we try to help?" He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Look, Charlie, I know you're scared. All of you are. But trust me, there's nothing out there that we need to worry about. Probably just a fox or something. Now, let's try to get some sleep. Okay, things will look better in the morning." But sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay awake in my tent, shared with Robert, listening to the sounds of the forest. Robert's whispers broke the silence. "Charlie, you awake?" I rolled over to face him. "Yeah, can't sleep either." He shook his head, his face pale in the dim light of the moon filtering through the tent fabric. "There's something wrong here, Charlie, really wrong. I've been tracking it." "Tracking what?" I asked, my heart beginning to race. "The anomalies, the electromagnetic disturbances. They're off the charts out here. That's what my device was for. Before Mr. Larson took it. Charlie, I don't think we're dealing with animals. I think there's something else out here. Something not natural." I wanted to laugh it off, to tell Robert he was being paranoid. But deep down, I knew he was right. There was something fundamentally wrong about these woods. Something that set every nerve on edge. A sudden scream pierced the night. Much closer this time. We bolted upright, our eyes wide with terror. It was followed by the sound of running feet, branches snapping, and then silence. "Boys? Everything okay in there?" Mr. Larson's voice came from outside, tense and alert. Before we could answer, another scream split the air. This time, I recognized the voice. It was Eric. What happened next was a blur of confusion and terror. We burst out of our tents to find Eric's empty, a trail of disturbed undergrowth leading into the dark forest. Mr. Larson was already charging down the path, flashlight in one hand, hunting knife in the other. "Eric, Eric, answer me," he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. We followed, stumbling through the darkness, branches whipping at our faces. The beam of Mr. Larson's flashlight danced crazily ahead of us, illuminating snippets of the forest, a gnarled root here, a flash of leaves there, and then, suddenly, the light fell on Eric. He was standing in a small clearing, his back to us, completely motionless. "Eric, thank God," Mr. Larson breathed, rushing forward. "Are you okay? What happened?" Eric didn't respond, didn't move. As we got closer, I felt a chill run down my spine. Something was very, very wrong. "Eric," I called out, my voice shaking. "Eric, come on, man, you're scaring us." Slowly, so slowly, Eric began to turn, and as his face came into view, illuminated by the harsh beam of the flashlight, I heard someone, maybe me, maybe all of us, let out a terrified scream. It wasn't Eric. Not anymore. The thing that faced us wore Eric's clothes, had Eric's blonde hair, but the face was wrong, distorted. The eyes were too large, the mouth a gaping maw filled with needle-sharp teeth, and the skin, it seemed to ripple and shift, as if something was moving beneath it. "Run," Mr. Larson whispered, his voice choked with horror. "Run." We turned and fled, crashing through the underbrush, blind with terror. Behind us, I could hear something pursuing, not footsteps, but a wet, slithering sound that seemed to come from all around us. I don't know how long we ran. Time lost all meaning in that nightmarish flight through the dark forest. All I knew was the burning in my lungs, the sting of branches against my skin, and the overwhelming need to get away. Finally, gasping for air, we burst into another clearing. This one was different. In the center stood a massive, ancient tree, its gnarled branches reaching towards the star-filled sky like grasping fingers. At its base was a dark opening, a cave or a hollow in the trunk. Couldn't tell. "In there," Mr. Larson panted, gesturing towards the opening. "Quick, before it catches up." We didn't hesitate. One by one, we squeezed through the narrow opening, finding ourselves in a spacious hollow within the tree. It was pitch black inside, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. "Is everyone here?" Mr. Larson whispered, his voice tight with fear. "Sound off." "Here," I gasped. "Present," came Peter's shaky voice. "Why, yeah," stammered Robert. A grunt from Jason confirmed his presence. 5 of us. We'd lost Eric, but the rest of us had made it. For now, outside, we could hear something moving, circling, waiting. "Mr. Larson," Robert whispered, his voice barely audible. What was that thing?" In the darkness, I heard Mr. Larson take a deep, shuddering breath. "I don't know, son. I've never seen anything like it, but I swear, I'm gonna get you boys out of here, somehow." As we huddled together in the hollow of that ancient tree, surrounded by the sounds of something inhuman prowling just outside, I realized that our ordeal was far from over. Whatever that thing was, whatever had taken Eric, it wasn't going to give up easily. And as the long night wore on, I began to wonder, was it just Eric it had taken? Or was it possible that none of us were who we thought we were anymore? The thought sent a fresh wave of terror through me. I pressed myself further into the damp earth of our hiding place, straining my ears for any sound that might give away the creature's location. But all I could hear was the ragged breathing of my friends and the wild pounding of my own heart. What had started as a simple camping trip had become a nightmare beyond imagination. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a terrible thought began to form. What if we never made it out of these woods? As the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the cracks in our wooden sanctuary, I realized that our fight for survival was only just beginning. The pale light of dawn brought little comfort. We'd spent the night huddled in that hollowed-out tree, jumping at every sound, every whisper of wind through the leaves. None of us had slept. How could we, after what we'd seen? "All right, boys," Mr. Larson whispered, his voice hoarse. "We need to make a plan. We can't stay here forever." "But what about that thing?" Peter asked, pushing his glasses up his nose with a trembling hand. "It's still out there, isn't it?" Mr. Larson's silence was answer enough. I could see the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, aging him years in a single night. He was supposed to protect us, to keep us safe. But how could anyone be prepared for something like this? "We need to get back to the car," he finally said. "It's our only chance of getting out of here and finding help for Eric." His voice caught on his son's name, and I saw a flash of raw pain cross his face before he composed himself. "But we don't even know where we are," Jason pointed out, his usual confidence replaced by fear. "We ran for who knows how long last night. We could be miles from our campsite." I might be able to help with that," Robert said hesitantly. We all turned to look at him. "Remember that device Mr. Larson confiscated? It wasn't just for tracking anomalies. It also has GPS." Mr. Larson's eyes widened. He quickly dug into his pocket, pulling out Robert's device. "Can you use this to get us back to the car?" Robert nodded, taking the device with reverent care. "I think so. It'll take me a few minutes to boot it up and get a signal." But dash! A blood-curdling shriek cut through the morning air, so close it seemed to vibrate through the very wood around us. We froze, hardly daring to breathe. "It's found us," I whispered, terror clawing at my throat. Mr. Larson's face set in grim determination. "Okay, change of plans. Robert, you work on getting that GPS going. The rest of us are going to make a run for it. We'll try to draw it away. Give Robert some time. Once you've got our location, try to make your way back to the car. If we're not there, just go. Get help." "But Mr. Larson dash," I started to protest. "No arguments. Charlie, it's our best chance." He turned to Robert. "You think you can do this, son?" Robert gulped but nodded, his fingers already dancing over the device's screen. "Good man. All right, boys, on my mark, we run. Robert, you stay here until it's clear." "Understood." We nodded, our hearts pounding in our chests. Mr. Larson peered out of the hollow, then held up 3 fingers. 2, 1, now! We burst out of the tree, sprinting in the opposite direction from where we'd heard the cry. I could hear it behind us almost immediately, that wet, slithering sound that haunted my nightmares. But we didn't look back. We couldn't. We ran until our lungs burned, weaving between trees, leaping over fallen logs. Mr. Larson led the way, his longer strides keeping him just ahead of us. And then, without warning, he wasn't. One moment he was there, crashing through the underbrush. The next, he was gone, as if the forest had swallowed him whole. "Mr. Larson," Peter cried out, skidding to a halt. We stopped, spinning around wildly, searching for any sign of him. There was nothing, no sound, no movement, just the eerie stillness of the forest. "We have to go back," Jason said, his voice shaking. "We can't just leave him." But even as he spoke, we heard it, that terrible, inhuman shriek, coming from the direction Mr. Larson had vanished. It was answered by another cry, this one undoubtedly human, a scream of pure agony that cut off abruptly, leaving behind a silence more terrifying than any sound. "Oh God," Peter whimpered. "Oh God, oh God, oh God." I felt like I was going to be sick. Mr. Larson was gone, just like Eric, taken by whatever ungodly thing lurked in these woods. And we were alone. We need to get back to Robert," I managed to say, my voice sounding strange and distant in my own ears. "We need to get out of here." The others nodded mutely, too shocked and scared to argue. We turned and began to make our way back the way we'd come, moving as quietly as we could. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through our systems. When we finally reached the hollow tree, we found Robert waiting for us, his face pale with fear. "I heard the screams," he whispered. "Mr. Larson?" I shook my head, unable to form the words. Robert's face crumpled, but he took a deep breath and held up his device. "I've got our location," he said. "The car's about 3 miles northeast of here. But guys, there's something else you need to see." He turned the screen towards us. First, I couldn't make sense of what I was looking at, a mess of lines and colors, like some abstract painting. But then I realized what it was, a topographical map of the area. And there, right where we were standing, was a swirling vortex of energy readings, pulsing like a malevolent heart. "What is that?" Jason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Robert's eyes were wide with a mix of fear and fascination. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's not natural, and I think it might be what's behind everything that's happening here." As we stared at the pulsing anomaly on the screen, a chilling realization swept over me. We weren't just lost in the woods. We were trapped in the heart of something ancient and evil, something that had already taken 2 of our number. And as another inhuman howl echoed through the forest, closer this time, I knew with terrifying certainty that it wouldn't stop until it had all of us. "We need to move," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. "Now," as we gathered what little supplies we had and prepared to make our desperate bid for escape. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something crucial, some piece of the puzzle that would explain why we were here, why this was happening to us. But there was no time to dwell on it. We had to run, had to fight, had to survive, because if we didn't make it out of these woods, no one would ever know the horror that lurked within them. And so, with heavy hearts and terror nipping at our heels, we set out into the forest once more, praying that we would live to see another dawn. We moved through the forest like ghosts, our feet barely making a sound on the leaf-strewn ground. Robert led the way, his eyes glued to the device in his hands, guiding us towards what we hoped was salvation. But with each step, the feeling of wrongness grew stronger, a palpable miasma that seemed to cling to our skin. "Wait," Peter suddenly whispered, grabbing my arm. "Do you hear that?" We all froze, straining our ears. First, I heard nothing but the usual forest sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird. But then, underneath it all, caught it, a low, pulsing hum, just on the edge of hearing. "It's getting stronger," Robert muttered, tapping at his device. "The energy readings are off the charts. We're getting close to something." "The car?" Jason asked hopefully. Robert shook his head. "No, this is different. I've never seen readings like this before." As if in response to his words, the forest around us began to change. The trees seemed to twist, their bark rippling like water. The ground beneath our feet softened, becoming spongy and unstable, and the air filled with whispers, countless voices speaking in languages I'd never heard before. "Guys," I said, my voice shaking, "I think we should turn back." But even as the words left my mouth, I realized it was too late. The forest behind us had changed, becoming an impenetrable wall of writhing vegetation. We had no choice but to press forward. As we stumbled onward, the world around us continued to warp and shift. Colors bled into one another, creating impossible hues that hurt to look at. The ground rose and fell in nauseating waves, and always, that maddening whisper in the air, growing louder with each step. Finally, we emerged into a clearing unlike anything I'd ever seen. In the center stood a massive structure, a twisted amalgamation of metal and organic matter. It pulsed with an otherworldly light, tendrils of energy arcing out to touch the trees surrounding it. What is that thing?" Jason breathed, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. Robert was furiously tapping at his device, his face pale. It's not from here," not from Earth. These readings, they're completely alien. As we stood there, trying to process what we were seeing, a figure emerged from behind the structure. My heart leapt into my throat. It was Eric's dad, Mr. Larson. But something was wrong. He moved with an unnatural fluidity, his joints bending in ways they shouldn't, and his eyes were completely black, reflecting the pulsing light of the alien structure. "Mr. Larson?" Peter called out hesitantly. Are you okay?" Mr. Larson's head snapped towards us, a smile spreading across his face that was too wide, too full of teeth. When he spoke, his voice was layered with others, as if 1,000 beings were speaking through him at once. "Okay? I'm more than okay. I'm perfect. We're perfect. And soon, you will be too." I managed to choke out. Mr. Larson's grin widened impossibly further. "Oh yes, you see, boys, we've been waiting for you for so long. We've been trapped here, in this little pocket of reality. But now, thanks to you, we can finally break free." As he spoke, more figures emerged from the shadows. Eric, the park ranger we'd seen at the trailhead, other hikers we didn't recognize, all moving with that same unnatural grace, all with those terrible, black eyes. "You were our beacons, not Mr. Larson continued. "Your fear, your confusion, your very humanity, it all served to weaken the barriers holding us here. And now, we're ready to spread across your world." The truth hit me like a physical blow. We hadn't stumbled upon this horror by accident. We'd been lured here, chosen. "Why us?" Robert asked, his scientific curiosity somehow overriding his terror. "Why children? Not Mr. Larson laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Children are so wonderfully malleable, so full of potential, the perfect vessels for our kind. And you five are special. You each carry a spark of something unique, something we need." He pointed at each of us in turn. "The adventurer, the scholar, the protector, the visionary, and you." His black eyes locked onto mine. "The survivor. Together, you'll be the key to our expansion, our invasion force." "We'll never help you," Jason growled, stepping protectively in front of us. "Oh, but you will." "Not Mr. Larson purred. "You don't have a choice. In fact, it's already begun. Haven't you noticed?" With dawning horror, I looked down at my hands. My skin was rippling, just like the bark of the trees had been. I could feel something moving beneath it, something trying to get out. "No," I whispered. "No, this can't be happening." But it was. I could feel my thoughts changing, alien concepts and memories flooding my mind. I looked at my friends and saw the same terror and confusion on their faces. We were changing. We were becoming them. As the alien presence clawed its way into my mind, one last, desperate thought managed to break through. This wasn't the end. Couldn't be. Somehow, someway, we had to fight this. We had to warn the world. But even as I clung to that final shred of humanity, I felt it slipping away, replaced by something vast and unknowable. And as the clearing filled with inhuman laughter, I realized that our camping trip had been more than just a nightmare. It was the beginning of the end of the world. As the alien presence invaded my mind, I felt myself slipping away. Memories, hopes, fears, all of it was being consumed by this otherworldly intelligence. But deep down, in a place I didn't even know existed, a spark of defiance ignited. "No, this is my body, my mind, my life." I don't know where the strength came from, but suddenly I was fighting back. I visualized walls in my mind, barriers against the invading consciousness. It wasn't easy. It felt like trying to hold back an ocean with my bare hands. But slowly, inch by inch, I began to reclaim myself. "Charlie," I heard Robert's voice, distant and distorted. "Charlie, what's happening to you?" I opened my eyes, not realizing I had closed them. The clearing swam into focus. My friends were on their knees, their bodies twisting and changing as the alien presence took hold. But they were looking at me with a mixture of awe and hope, because I was standing, unchanged, human. The thing wearing Mr. Larson's face snarled, its features contorting into something inhuman. Impossible. It hissed. You can't resist us. No one can resist us. But I had, somehow, some way, I had found the strength to fight back. And in that moment, I realized something crucial. This wasn't just about me. It was about all of us. About humanity. You're wrong, I said, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. We can resist. We will resist. I reached out to Jason, the closest to me. Come on, big guy. I know you're in there. Fight it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Jason's hand twitched, reaching for mine. I grabbed it, and it was like an electric current passed between us. I could feel Jason's essence, his humanity, surging back to the surface. That's it, I encouraged, reaching for Peter with my other hand. Come on, guys, remember who you are. One by one, my friends began to shake off the alien influence. It wasn't easy. I could see the strain on their faces, the battle raging inside them, but they were doing it. They were coming back. The not Mr. Larson let out a shriek of rage and frustration. The air around us began to vibrate, the alien structure pulsing with angry red light. You fools, it howled. You have no idea what you're giving up. The power, the knowledge. It could all be yours. We don't want it, I said firmly. Not at this price. As my friends regained control of themselves, something strange began to happen. The clearing around us started to shift and warp, like reality itself was coming undone. The alien structure flickered, becoming translucent. No! The creature wearing Mr. Larson's face wailed. No, you're ruining everything. I understood then. Our resistance, our humanity, it was somehow undoing whatever force had brought this thing into our world. We were closing the door it had tried to open. Guys, I said urgently, we need to get out of here. Now. We ran. We ran like we'd never run before, crashing through the underbrush as the world fell apart around us. Trees melted into nothingness. The ground rippled like water, and all the while that unearthly howl followed us, filled with rage and despair. I don't know how long we ran, or how we found our way, but suddenly, miraculously, we burst out of the forest and onto the road where we'd parked the car. It was still there, untouched, a beacon of normalcy in a world gone mad. Get in, I yelled, yanking open the driver's door. Thank God Mr. Larson had left the keys in the ignition. We piled in, and I turned the key. For one heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then the engine roared to life, and I floored it, sending us hurtling down the road and away from the nightmare behind us. It wasn't until we'd put miles between us and those awful woods that we finally let ourselves breathe, let ourselves think about what had happened. Charlie, Peter said quietly, you saved us. How? I shook my head, still not entirely sure myself. I don't know. I just couldn't let it win. I couldn't let it take us. But Mr. Larson, Jason said, his voice breaking, and Eric, they're still. We'll come back, I said firmly. We'll get help, real help, and we'll find a way to save them. I didn't know if it was possible. I didn't know if anything would ever be the same again. But I did know one thing: we had faced the impossible, stared into the abyss of an alien horror, and we had survived. We had held onto our humanity. As the first rays of sunlight began to paint the sky, I felt a glimmer of hope. Whatever came next, whatever battles we might face, we would face them together, and we would never, ever give up, because that's what it means to be human, to fight, to hope, to survive. And as I drove us towards home, towards safety, I made a silent promise to Mr. Larson, to Eric, to everyone who had been taken by that thing in the woods. We would find a way to save them. We would find a way to stop this, even if that meant that it cost me my own well-being. Story number 3. Don't camp on Talon Island. There's no official name for Talon Island. The small island is roughly 450 feet long and 100 feet wide. Even this is subject to the water level of Kentucky Lake. I've seen the island larger and smaller depending on rainfall. It's not impossible to swim there, but I'd advise against it. It's near the middle of the main channel. For best results, use a boat. My friends and I have made several attempts to camp there, but each time we've hit a snag. Most recently, my friend Callie got into a car accident 15 minutes before we were supposed to meet up at her place. Realizing that the plans would eventually fall through, I set out to the island by myself. It's not terribly hard to get there, with little more than a rowboat and a backpack of gear. I set out to camp on an island I've been dreaming about since I was a teenager. I set out from the boat dock at Irvin Cobb and rowed into the main channel before drifting north a while. It wasn't long until I was pulling my small metal boat onto the shore and scouting a place to camp. It was around noon when I had gathered enough driftwood and rocks to build a small fire pit near the middle of the island. There wasn't much in the way of elevation, but I figured the highest point on the island would be the safest. One of the first things I noticed was the complete lack of cell reception. I wasn't worried though. It wasn't uncommon for signal to be spotty on that side of the county. I set up my tent and prepped the fire for later. What followed was an afternoon of fishing and day drinking. It was around 8 and starting to get dark when I pulled my fish from the water and moved up to my campsite. Despite a few lights in the distance, the sky was rather free of light pollution. I lit the campfire and let it get going as I cleaned the fish and got ready for a night of camping under the stars. I spent the night huddled up in my tent, falling asleep to the comforting sounds of the local wildlife on the far shore to either side of the island. I woke the next morning to a light drizzling rain. The small drops of water sizzled as they hit the fire pit. Not wanting to spend a day on the small island with dark storm clouds on the horizon, I packed up my tent and moved down to the shore. It was around that time when I noticed that my boat was gone. It wasn't long before I was running up and down the shore looking for any sign of my boat. I had pulled it far enough up onto the shore that it couldn't have floated away. The water hadn't risen to the point it could have swept it off either. I walked around the island a few times with my eye trained on the water and the distant shores, only to realize I had no chance of finding the small metal rowboat. The rain had picked up from a light drizzle to a steady pour, and I realized I was going to have to get out of the weather somehow. I wasn't looking forward to setting up my tent in the rain, but I knew it was the only way I was going to get any peace as the rain continued to pour. I must have looked a sight. I was huddled up in an army surplus tent, sitting in my underwear as I hung my clothes up to dry. The rain pelted the outside of the tent and made it impossible to focus on anything other than the sound of the rain beating against the canvas. Despite this, I couldn't help but hear the sound of footfalls crunching on the rocky soil outside. Thinking my friends had finally come out to find me, I poked my head outside only to see that I was alone. No sooner than I had poked my head out, I watched lightning strike the shore and the loud crash of thunder that immediately followed. The storm was directly overhead and the lighting danced across the lake as the thunder boomed around me. One of the lighting strikes was so close that it lit up the inside of the tent, and for a brief moment I thought I could see the silhouette of a man standing outside. I again poked my head outside only to have a shower of water attack my face and hair. I scanned the area around my tent for any sign of movement only to find nothing. Someone was there. I wasn't seeing or hearing things. I slipped on my swimming shoes and went out into the rain wearing little more than my boxers as I decided to search the small island for any sign of the other occupant. The waves beat against the eastern shore as I walked north in search of anyone who might have landed on the island while I was trying to dry off. It only took a few minutes to completely circle the island, and once again I couldn't find anyone. I returned to my tent to find my clothes had been taken from the tent along with my backpack. As the rain let up, I realized I was stuck on the island with no boat, no clothes, no fishing gear, and no phone. If there was someone on the island, they were either invisible or damned good at hiding. Gray, cloudy skies hid the sun from me as I contemplated my situation and tried to wrap my mind around how screwed I was. I briefly considered swimming to shore, but knew better than to cross that channel after a fresh rain. I was stuck without food, and my only shelter was an army surplus pup tent that barely survived the last storm. I could already see darker clouds to the south and knew I was in for one hell of a storm compared to the last. It rained for 2 solid days. I hadn't bothered telling anyone I was coming, and I couldn't trust that anyone was looking for me either. I made it through the days by trying to arrange rocks on the shore to say the word. Fuck. I wasn't sure anyone would show up if it said help. But I knew a curse word would offend local sensibilities, that someone would show up and help. I worked all day to get that message sent, only to come out of my tent the following morning and see that all of the rocks were gone. I hadn't eaten in 2 days, and I had been surviving off of rainwater and the one edible plant that grew on that island. Despite this, 2 days of raw cattail and rainwater had me ready to devour a whole cattle farm. The rain wasn't letting up, and something on that island was ruining any chance I had for signaling help. I decided to throw caution to the wind and attempt to swim away while I still had the energy to do so. It was roughly 800 feet to an adjacent island and another 1,000 to the shore. There were a few houses there, but I hadn't seen any lights in them for the past 2 days. I figured the power was out or something. The storm had been pretty bad. Now, I'm not the best swimmer, and I have to admit that first leg of the swim was difficult as hell. I thrashed against the water as it seemed intent to pull me down and to the side. Even then, my biggest fear was that lightning would strike while I was in the water. I was less than 100 feet from the next island when my thrashing about proved pointless, and I was pulled under by the current of the lake. The undertow had pulled me, and I thought I was done for. For a brief moment, I even felt something scrape against my back before I felt the cool air on my arm and thrashed to right myself and get a breath of precious air. I saw a shore in front of me and beat my arms and legs against the water frantically, only to reach the shore and realize I was back on Talon Island. If not to make matters worse, it was clear from where I was standing that my tent was gone. I screamed and I cursed as I stormed around the island looking for any trace of my belongings in vain. My arms and legs were sore from my attempt at swimming, and the stinging on my back made all the more sense when I went to probe it with my left hand and pulled it back to see the rain washing away the blood on my fingers. I screamed more and I cursed more as I set about the small island, trying to build anything resembling a shelter. It was clear to me that something wasn't letting me leave, and I wasn't about to die on that damned island. It was another dinner of raw cattail before a night curled up in the fetal position, trying to find anything resembling warmth on a pile of leaves nestled under a lean-to made of branches and driftwood. It was during that night that I finally saw him. It was a naked man with a long beard standing on the edge of the shore. He stared right at me with a blank expression as I tried to pull myself further into the makeshift shelter. A flash of lighting in the distance flickered and the man was gone. There was something so incredibly unsettling about him that left me unwilling or unable to fall back asleep. I spent the rest of the night half alert as I tried desperately to survive the night. At some point, I fell asleep. I woke the next morning sore and tired. The sun was low in the sky and the water seemed to have calmed down a little. I didn't think so much as move toward the shore where the man had been standing when I walked into the water and swam to the next island without incident. I was on autopilot as I made the last stretch to the shore and walked up the beach toward the first house I saw. I must have looked something awful as I stood there in soaked boxer shorts with cuts and scrapes all over my body. I think I might have got 2 words out when the owner opened the door before collapsing. The police think I'm crazy. My boat was found downstream a few miles down with my bag, clothes, and tent inside. I told this story to the staff at the hospital and later to the police, and in both cases I was confronted with the discovery of my boat dam near in Aurora. I told them about the 3 days I had spent on that island and the man who had been stalking me, only for them to tell me I had been gone for more than a week. My friends and I aren't planning any more camping trips this summer. I don't know who or what was messing with me on that island. But one thing is certain, I was not welcome there. So please, if you are considering a camping adventure around LBL this summer, don't camp on Talon Island. Story number 4. Don't go camping alone. Ever. I ain't scared of nothing. That's what I yelled to my brother as I slammed the door to my car shut. Things have changed since then. I've changed. I remember his smirk, how he held out my jacket, the way he spouted off an endless list of things I should be scared of. Skinwalkers and witches and werewolves, oh my. He presented each one as reason after reason of why this idea was stupid, saying I still had time to flake out. Save face. I remember rolling my eyes, snatching my jacket from his grasp, sliding into my car and yelling that I'm not scared before speeding away towards the darkening outline of the mountains. They stood out stark against the setting sun like teeth. Boy, how I wish I listened. I was wrong. He was right. I'm fucking scared. Let me back up a bit. It all started about 2 days ago. I was out of my mind, depressed. Could barely get out of bed. Thought about chucking myself in front of cars, over bridges, off buildings, just dying. I thought about dying all the time, and enough was enough. One of the few friends I had suggested that I try solo camping said it might clear my mind, that the wilderness, the silence, the solitude would do me good. He gave me a list of spots, some more isolated than the others. I decided on the most isolated one, which was about a 3-hour hike from the last campsite far out in the Rocky Mountain National Forest. I remember his face, the surprise, the acceptance. You sure? His voice cracked. I nodded, saying nothing. Okay, I mean, it's a pretty secluded place, especially for a first-time camper. He shrugged, but then again, it's a beautiful spot. It'll definitely give you some perspective. And the night sky out there is insane. I thanked him and turned to leave, but he spoke up again. Hey, don't let the forest spook you. Okay, a word of advice from a veteran. Don't go out at night no matter what you hear. You might get totally fucked by a bear or lion. The drive up the mountains was strangely soothing. The gently curving roads that wove their way through the trees and up the rocks were exciting to navigate. And soon my mind was eased into a peaceful contemplation. I had decided to forego electronics this trip, even going as far as securing my phone in my glove box. I wanted to be completely free of all that shit, able to focus on the now rather than ruminate about the past or fear the future. I would be gone for 5 days and 4 nights, enough time for me to, hopefully, recuperate and reassess my life and what I was doing with it. I soon descended into Estes Park and drove through the picturesque town towards RM&P, willing myself not to stay at the Stanley instead. I found the entrance to the park with ease and continued to the closest lot to my campsite. Night was now falling and I silently cursed myself for leaving so late. I sat in my car for a good 30 minutes before deciding that it would be too risky hiking 3 hours in near pitch black. There were 4 other tents set up in the lot I was at with room for 1 more, and soon I had my own tent set up. That night passed comfortably. I was surrounded by chatting, laughing people and unruly, but happy children who ran round and round screaming. A few of them offered me roasted hot dogs and s'mores and beers, and I filled my belly. Smiling, I was rolled up in my sleeping bag before the last light from the dying embers faded away. The second night didn't go so smoothly. I woke up late, well-rested, but still groggy, and took my time repacking my tent. I hesitated at first, wondering if I should just stay there. But at 3 p.m., another family showed up with proof they had reserved the site. So I gathered my things and set off, and immediately got lost. Navigating by map and compass for the first time and alone is a lot harder than it sounds. And the trees can be misleading, can turn you around, make you think you're on the right path when really you're miles from where you're supposed to be. Instead of taking me 3 hours to get to the site, it took me nearly twice that time, and I was swiftly losing what little light was left in the day. Finally I found the site, but before I breathed a sigh of relief, I haphazardly set up my tent, building a small fire in front. It was dark now and I was jumpy. Every sound I heard was seemingly magnified, every shadow cast by the dim light of the fire. A menace. Spooked, I crawled into the tent and curled up in my bag, trying to will myself into sleep. After a while, I was dozing, about to drift off, when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a foot crunching outside. My eyes shot open and I reached for my flashlight, but didn't turn it on. I waited. I heard the sound again. Someone or something was definitely walking around my tent. It sounded like whatever they was trying to be quiet, stealthy. That went on for hours in inconsistent bursts until I finally decided it was an animal, scavenging for the scraps or inspecting my tent. By dawn, I was dozing again and the noise had finally stopped. I told myself I would sleep for an hour or two, giving myself time to rest up. I woke up disoriented, exhausted, and started to panic before remembering I was out camping and that I needed to start hiking back. But when I exited the tent, I saw that the sun was already setting. To say I was upset would be an understatement. I hesitated for a moment, trying to decide what to do. I wanted to go home. I wanted to leave, see how far I could get out there. But deep down I knew I'd instantly get lost and probably end up in a worse situation. So, I began collecting as much wood as I could to build a big-ass fire and prepared to hunker down for the night. The light from the sun seemed to disappear unfathomably fast. The third night was pretty problematic. I sat awake in my tent for hours after the sun went down, waiting. I'd left the fire going for as long as the wood lasted. I know this isn't kosher for camping, but I was improvising and I was absolutely terrified. The darkness around me seemed to crush the light from the fire, making it seem small, pathetic, a tiny candle in a sea of shadows. For hours I sat there, listening, afraid. Finally, I realized I was just being ridiculous. That what I had heard the night before was nothing to fear. That my subconscious, my monkey mind, was just playing tricks on me, keeping me alert for no reason. So I bundled myself up and laid down. And I heard it, softly at first, a footstep, then 2, 3, growing louder, bolder. I sat up and felt my eyes increase to the size of saucers and my breath quickened. What was that? I had to know. I wasn't thinking. I wasn't. I was operating purely off of fear. I heard the noise. It sounded like something running and running around and around my tent. Suddenly, the side of my tent pushed in as if someone was slapping it from the outside. "Hey!" I yelled, scared out of my wits. "Hey! I'm awake. I'm in here." I tried to stand, tripping myself up in my sleeping bag in the process, and slammed into the front of the tent. Scrambling up, I swiftly unzipped the flap and ran outside with a red-tinted flashlight. I saw a shape scurry away and followed. And there, standing at the edge of the firelight, barely visible, was the silhouette of a person. They were standing with their back towards me. Their arms were hanging in strange positions by their sides. Their head pointed straight away from me. I took a step towards them and a branch cracked underneath me. The sound seemed to startle the person and they turned their head ever so slightly. "Hey!" I said again. "What the fuck, man?" And it boiled up, a sound that crescendoed into a scream. It was laughter, and it echoed around me, rattling around in my skull. I ran, leaping into my tent, zipping it up behind me, curling into my sleeping bag, crying, and the world around me exploded, or rather imploded. The walls of the tent shook, like hundreds of hands were slapping it, poking it, punching it. Outside, what sounded like dozens of people running around shattered the silence. I don't know how or when I fell asleep. I think I fainted. Either way, I woke up the next day to a reddish glow encompassing my surroundings. I sat up and ran outside, looking around for proof of what I had heard. But there was nothing, no footprints, handprints, or any disturbance at all. "Fuck this," I muttered to myself, throwing my things chaotically into my bag. I would leave today, in the dark. I couldn't stay another night here. I was just starting to unpole the tent when I heard it. A sound in the distance, perhaps carried to me by the wind which was picking up around me. "Help me! Help me! Please! Oh God! Oh God! Help me!" I reacted more out of instinct than logic and began running towards the sound before realizing that I, in no way, was in a place to help whoever was screaming. Still, I tried to locate the source of the sound, following the voice for about 30 minutes. "Where are you?" I yelled, looking around me through the maze of trees. "I'm here. Where are you?" Quickly, the screams descended into a deep, unsettling laughter. Scared out of my mind, I turned and ran back the way I came. By some miracle, I made it back to my site, grabbed my pack, and uprooted the poles of the tent, thinking that I would just roll it up and carry it back instead of taking the time to fold it neatly and shove it into its bag. Around me, the mountains loomed up like fangs, like I was about to be swallowed whole by a monstrous mouth. As I pulled each pole, the tent fell a little, but it was only on the third pole of out 6 that I realized it wasn't falling fully flat. Confused, I peered into the tent and reeled in horror, too afraid to even scream. There was someone sitting inside, but not just anyone. It was me, sitting there, pallor and bone-thin, a too-wide grin plastered on my face. A single droplet of blood rolled down from each eye which, instead of having green irises, were totally, wholly black. I jumped back, tripping over my own feet. Laughter rose up around me, and as I scrambled up, I saw my hand that was not my hand reach out from the tent, followed swiftly by the other, then the head. My face that was not my face looked up at me, still smiling, then laughed again. I screamed. I stood. I ran. And I ran. I didn't even know if I was running the right way. I couldn't even use the sun anymore for guidance since it had almost fully set. I ran without looking where I was going. I kept looking behind me to see if that thing was following me. I could feel the trees scratching me up, pushing against me, like they were trying to hold me back. Hold me still until that thing came for me. Suddenly a light flashed in my face and I ran into something solid, something black, something that wrapped around me. I instantly cowered, hiding my face in my hands. Shit. Oh, please God, no, 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 no. I heard my own voice, terrified, shaking. Hey, calm down. It's okay. You just scared me. Calm down. What's wrong? I looked up and into the worried gray eyes of a human face. The face of a middle-aged man, to be exact. He was holding me up. The flashlight he was using lay fallen at our feet, creating strange shadows behind us. I looked back, fearful of what I might see, but there was nothing. Only trees swinging slowly in the slight breeze. Hey, he said again. Was that you? Screaming? I came out here to check. I couldn't speak. I was too terrified. I shook my head. Were you camping out there alone? He asked, letting me go and bending down to retrieve the flashlight. I nodded, then began crying. Hey, it's okay. Can be spooky out here. Come on. My car is right over there. He gestured with his head back behind him. I wiped my nose and blinked, finally finding my voice. Who are you? He glanced at me, then away. I'm a park ranger, but he didn't look like one. He was wearing a smooth black suit, black tie, and white shirt, and his shoes were polished leather, not hiking boots. Come on, he said again, taking my pack and swinging it onto his back. As he did so, his jacket flapped slightly and I saw what looked like a Sig Sauer handgun strapped to his belt. Okay, I said, looking back behind me again. How did you find me? He shrugged. Good hearing. We entered a small clearing and I saw a matte black SUV with tinted windows, headlights flaring, engine idling, parked in the middle of it. He popped the trunk and threw my bag in as I climbed into the passenger side seat. He climbed in the driver's seat and asked me where he should take me. I told him the lot number and we were on our way. After a few moments, he flipped the cubby between us open and pulled out a bag. Corn nuts, he asked, holding out the bag to me. I took it gratefully and began chomping away. I licked my fingers, then looked back at him. So, are you really a ranger? He looked at me, then back to the road, but still I stared at him, transfixed. He looked exhausted, his wood-colored hair disheveled and dirty from the forest. The SUV jerked to a sudden stop and the man let out a slow, low breath. His eyes narrowed and he looked over at me, then back to the dirt trail in front of us. I followed his gaze, feeling the fear churning up inside me. And there, in the middle of the road, was me, the me that was not me. Its limbs hung limply, as if they were broken, and that sickly smile was still plastered across the face. It waved. The man looked back at me, then back at the thing that was not me, then back at me. I met his gaze. I don't get paid enough for this shit. The man muttered before slamming his foot on the accelerator straight towards the thing. We both felt the impact. The car bounced over the body and the man kept driving. But around us, in between the trees, stirred into the darkness, laughter boiled up, manic and persistent. We reached the lot in silence, bathed in the first light of the rising sun. The man beside me seemed to be deep in thought, distracted. I was still scared, but hopeful that whatever that thing was, it was now dead, crushed by the car, or at least so badly wounded that it would soon succumb. The SUV slowed to a stop and the man popped the trunk and hopped out. He walked to the back and grabbed my pack as I jumped out. He handed to me and I took it, then thanked him for everything. "No problem," he said. "All in a days. Or nights. Work." His lips quivered as if he was about to smile. I turned to leave, but he spoke up again. "Hey!" I turned to face him again. "If you ever want to talk about what you saw, or, just talk, call me." He held out a card. I took it and looked down at it. It was matte black and only had a single number written on it. There was no area code. "Then," I began, but I heard a door slam and looked up. The man was already back in his car. He waved at me, then sped off back the way we had come, back towards that thing. I shoved the card in my pocket, climbed into my car, and left, breathing a sigh of relief. I still haven't told anyone about what happened, even when they asked why I refused to go camping ever again. I just shrug and tell them it wasn't my thing, that I prefer a warm bed and the bustling sounds of a busy city. Every so often, though, I'll pull out the card, my fingers lingering over my phone, wondering if I should call, wondering who the man really was and if he'd really be able to explain what happened to me. Story number 5. I don't go camping anymore. Let me preface this by saying that I realize that camping alone in the middle of nowhere isn't the smartest activity a person can engage in. I've lost count of the times that well-meaning busybodies have lectured me about it. But, frankly, I just don't care. You see, all of my life I've done things that I don't particularly want to do. I went to school. I got a job. I pay my bills. Camping, the stillness and the solitude of the forest at night gives me joy, and joy seems in short supply most days. I never felt afraid in the woods. No matter how remote, I only ever felt calm, peaceful, like I was doing what I was always meant to do. That doesn't mean that I never took precautions. There are 3 things that a solitary woman needs in the woods: a good first aid kit, a good compass, and a good dog. I always went out with all 3, and I always thought that those things could keep me from whatever might be out there in the forest. I was wrong, of course, but just because I only ever considered the living threats. The last camping trip I'll ever take started out normally. I had planned a 3-night loop through a stretch of woods I'd never been to before, due to the unfamiliar and remote terrain, and the fact that I wouldn't be following an established trail. I was only planning on hiking about 8 miles a day before setting up camp each evening. That way, I wouldn't ever be too exhausted to make good decisions, and could generally enjoy my new surroundings more thoroughly. I loaded up my pack with all the supplies I'd need, told my parents where I'd be and when I'd return, and headed out to a part of the state that was completely foreign to me. I arrived at the forest early in the day and parked alongside a deserted stretch of gravel road. I could see no sign that the road had been driven down in quite some time, and the thought of having this whole section of woods to myself filled me with a moment of glee. That moment intensified when I opened the passenger side of my car to let Susie out. Susie was the kind of dog that provoked endless speculation about her genetic line, but ultimately she was several different kinds of mutt all rolled into one. Though not particularly intimidating to look at, Susie was loyal and protective. I wouldn't go on a hike without her by my side, and she was never happier than when she was walking along with me. Susie gave me confidence that I could handle whatever the wilderness threw my way, with my pack loaded high and heavy on my back. Susie and I headed out into the woods. The route I had chosen was rugged and varied, and often I had to stop to check my map and compass. I had opted to walk along the ridgeline the first day, and found that the way was a gauntlet of loose rocks and fallen trees. There was no sign of humanity there, no empty bottles or trailblazes to pull me back into civilization. Despite the hard going, it was paradise. That evening, I set up camp at a clearing near one of the higher ridges. I turned in a bit earlier than I had originally wanted, driven into my tent by the bite of the early fall air. Susie snuggled in next to me as I zipped myself into my sleeping bag. Before I knew it, I had been lulled into sleep by the chorus of chirping night insects around me. I woke up in the early morning hours to silence. A glance at my watch showed that it was 1:45, too early to be anything other than dead asleep. The full moon above illuminated the night, and I spent several seconds watching the shadows of the tree branches dance across the top of my tent. It was downright cold by then, and I zipped my sleeping bag more tightly. I looked at Susie, still laying next to my body. Her eyes were open and focused on something beyond the tent. The wind must have woken her, too. I closed my eyes, hoping to fall quickly back to sleep. When I felt Susie growl against me, I murmured a reassurance. It's probably just a deer. Pup. Something, though, didn't feel right. Susie wasn't the type of dog to growl at passing animals. In fact, she lived her life as though other creatures were curiosities at best, and distractions at worst. The only time I'd heard her growl like that was 2 years ago when a black bear came shuffling down a trail and caught us unawares. In a weird way, the thought of a bear outside the tent was a relief. My bag was hung from a tree, and bears in this part of the country weren't known to be aggressive. I stroked Susie's fur and waited for the animal to sniff around the campground, determined that we weren't that interesting, and leave. I strained to listen, but all I could hear was the sound of Susie's growling, so low and constant that it could have been a purr. I waited for what seemed like hours, but never heard the animal outside. As the morning went on, Susie's growls turned to soft whimpers, and I let her crawl into my sleeping bag with me. The sleep that came was fitful and interrupted by strange nightmares. But the morning sunlight eventually made its way into the tent. You may be wondering at this point why I didn't turn around and walk right back out of the woods, to my car, and back to civilization. Well, the simple reason is that I wasn't worried. So, I thought, a bear came around the campsite. It wasn't that big of a deal. And besides, I'd be another 8 miles away by the time night came around again. I packed myself up, had a leisurely breakfast, and set out again. The morning's hike was uneventful and beautiful, though Susie stuck disconcertingly close by me, neglecting her usual explorations and mouth ajar with anxiety. Every time I tried to pet her, she stiffened, so I let her be and continued walking on. We stopped in a quiet clearing for late lunch, more than 6 miles into the day's hike. It wasn't until I was packing up to leave that I noticed it. The silence was total in this clearing. No birds, no cicadas, no rustle of leaves where squirrels leapt from tree to tree, sent a chill down my spine, and I noticed Susie watching the woods ahead. "Let's get out of here, girl." She looked up at me and whined. When we arrived at the edge of the woods, I immediately saw why there were no bird songs. Their little feathered bodies lay on the forest floor, dotting the fallen leaves with reds, blues, whites, and yellows. I poked a bluebird with my hiking stick, turning it over, looking for signs of predation or illness. I saw nothing strange, other than the mere fact of the lifeless body itself. I expected to need to call Susie to me. Birds were a favorite snack, but she had backed up behind me, another low growl escaping her curled lips. I stepped back to her and clipped a leash to her collar, fearing that she might run, or that I might. The woods remained dead silent. My heart had frozen in my chest, clenched tightly but somehow beating forcefully at the same time. Something was very wrong, and I needed to get out of this forest. I stood where I was and tried to think. I was 14 miles from where I parked my car. If I went back the way I came, given the terrain, I knew I wouldn't make it back before nightfall. I had in my pack a compass and map. I could try to map a new route, one that might take me back faster. But there was no guarantee that I could find my way before dark either. I was at the halfway point of the route, and I had to make the decision: keep going or turn back. I thought back to the campsite the night before. Something was out there. Maybe it was just a bear, but maybe it was something else. The thought of going back to that spot to sleep made me shudder. I knew that I needed to keep going. I'd get as many miles as I could during the rest of the daylight hours, get a few hours of sleep, and then finish tomorrow ahead of schedule. I just had to make it through another night, and I'd be back at my car. I steadied myself and forged ahead. Susie tense beside me, hackles raised. The miles melted behind us. There were no stops, no breaks to look at flowers or have a snack. Just the constant sound of my boots striking the ground to break the unnatural quiet. Birds littered the ground, and when I came to the next clearing, I had to step carefully through a mass of bodies where a flock of starlings was downed. As I walked, I kept an eye on the trees around me, but saw no movement, only that awful stillness. Slowly the light began to fade, its rays become orange and diffuse through the leaves. I knew that I had to stop, that I couldn't keep going through the night. The tent, though made of polyester and carbon fiber, would at least allow me the illusion of security. I found a clearing, mostly devoid of dead birds, and set up camp. Susie whimpered, "It's okay, girl. We'll be out of here tomorrow. I promise." I was in my tent before the sun finished its descent behind the trees, hand wrapped tightly around one of my hiking poles, and Susie next to me. Whatever was out here, I just hoped it would leave me alone. I drifted in and out of consciousness, the strain of the day overcoming me in waves before the nightmares pulled me back into the world. Susie didn't sleep at all, as far as I could tell. She just lay there stiffly, every so often emitting another low growl and licking her lips nervously. When I was awake, I listened. The wind moved the branches above me, but nothing else made a sound. I mentally clung to the creaks and groans of the trees, something familiar and reassuring in this strange place. Eventually, though, that too became twisted and bizarre. The branches began to sway above me ferociously, casting shadow fingers across the top of my tent. The wind, however, sounded as if it were dying down. It was as if the branches were moving on their own. But, of course, that couldn't be. I sat up in my sleeping bag, freeing my arms and drawing Susie in closer to me. The warmth of her little body and the feel of her breathing gave me comfort in the moments before we both heard it. A crunch of footfall right outside made Susie lunge for the tent door. Frantically, she began clawing at the fabric, whining and snapping her teeth. I tried to hold her still, but she was fighting me at every turn. When the fabric ripped, there was nothing I could do. She bolted into the night. I heard her yelp seconds later, and the silence returned. Before I could even process what had just happened, the tent began to shake. The tree branches, once just shadows upon the surface, now grasped and raked against my tent, tearing gashes along its seams. I fought my way out, still clutching the hiking pole, but hopelessly aware of how little good it did. I emerged into the little clearing of my campsite, my ruined tent illuminated by a full moon. The trees were motionless, just as they should be, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood to attention. Though the air was still, the only thing that I could hear was my own ragged breath and the quick percussion of blood through my ears. I backed slowly into the bark of the nearest tree, feeling totally exposed in the clearing. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, but the silence continued. Around me, the shadows morphed and writhed as the moon made its way across the sky. My eyes saw things that were not there, and the cold began to seep into my bones. I could think of nothing else to do standing alone and vulnerable in the night, so I started talking, at first to myself, and then to whatever was with me. "Please, I'm sorry," I choked back giant, ugly sobs. "I didn't mean to disturb you. I didn't know. I'm leaving, I swear. Just one more day and I'll be gone. Please, please." Please became a mantra, a point of focus for my ever-unraveling mind. Instead of looking for forms in the shadows, I instead centered my thoughts around the word, how it felt in my mouth and how it sounded hoarser and hoarser as the night went on. By the time the gray morning light began to seep through the trees, I was numb. I was numb from fear, from cold, from grief. I was unsure if I could find the strength in my legs to hike out of this place. But I did. I left my tent where it lay in tatters and started into the woods alone. The rest of the day barely registered with me, if I'm being completely honest. I remember the silence, the feeling of being watched, and pleas on my cracked lips. When I finally made it back to my car, I didn't even have the energy to cry. Sometime later, when I felt well enough to revisit my experience, I looked up the forest, this corner of nowhere, online. I read stories about the isolation and the wilderness of the forest, about logging crews who had abandoned their machinery, about how the trails had become overgrown and useless. I had seen these stories before my trip, and they excited me, the solitude of it all, the remote, rugged terrain that had driven the less adventurous away. But now I had context. I understood. The forest wasn't for me. It wasn't for any of us. And it made sure that it would always be that way. Story number 6. My brother and I went camping, but it turned into a nightmare. My brother and I had heard rumors of a mysterious ghost woman that wandered a specific trail of a forest near us. The forest was across the street from an old house nobody lived in anymore. It was also rumored that the land used to be home to Native Americans years and years ago, and there may have been a burial ground somewhere within the woods. I've been in the forest many different times in my life, and not once had I ever seen this woman that so many others were raving about. So we decided to put the mystery to the test. Apparently, you had to go out there during the new moon. I must have coincidentally missed all the conditions that needed to be met to see her each time I went out there in the past. But if she was real, then Chuck and I were going to find out. We packed our camping gear, normal stuff like tents, canteens, a couple of flashlights and matches for a fire. We brought food too, snacks for the long night. If nothing happened then, we'd have some extra stuff to eat the day after. When we were ready, we drove to the house across from the woods. The elderly woman who used to live there had been taken to a care facility, so we assumed it was okay if we parked in her driveway for a night. I remember after we parked, Chuck turned to me and asked, "You really think we'll see something out there?" I doubt it, but curiosity can't hurt. Besides, I've been meaning to hang out with you recently anyway. He began stepping out of the car. Well, let's hope this wandering woman is the friendly kind. That was something I doubted too. The story went like this. A woman by the name of Darcy was out with a group of her friends in the woods. They were partying, as some people do, and having the time of their lives. Darcy was wearing a yellow dress, not quite suitable for the outdoors, and she had long, wavy brown hair with freckles peppering her face. That night the group ran out of something, the details aren't that specific, and the group needed someone to go get more of whatever that something was. They played rock, paper, scissors, and Darcy lost, meaning she had to walk the 2-track road back to the start of the forest and get more from the trunk of her friend's car. I can't speak for what she experienced, but I can tell you she didn't make it back to the start of the forest. Apparently, someone who wasn't invited decided to storm down the 2-track path like a bat out of hell. The group didn't drive their vehicles into the woods because of space issues, and some might have gotten stuck. And without warning, Darcy was run over at a ridiculous speed for someone driving at night down a dirt trail. It was said that she suffered massive windpipe damage and internal organ rupturing, as I expect one would after being run over. She gurgled her last words before passing away under the light of the new moon. Bones hurt, and since then, the rumor is that if you go out there during the exact same time of her death, you will see her wandering the trail until vanishing into thin air. I say I doubt her kindness because from some of the stories I've heard, people mention her being aggressive towards them. So my plan is to maintain a further distance from the trail. I mean, it's almost grown over now, so it's actually pretty hard to see in some spots, especially at night, I imagine. Anyway, Chuck and I gathered our things. I slung my backpack over my shoulders, and he did the same with his before I locked the car and stuffed the keys in my pocket. We walked to the edge of the main road, looked both ways, and then crossed to the tree line on the other side. It was about midday now, so we had plenty of time to sort ourselves out before possibly having the pants scared off of us. "Well, here we go. Into the fray," said Chuck with a sly grin. Yeah. You'll be joking real hard, I'm sure, when Darcy comes out and sneaks up on you while you're sleeping." He laughed boisterously. "Don't worry. I'll just make her swoon with my manly charm." "Good luck with that, stupid," I said in response. I struggled to match his jovial mood. We walked for about 10 minutes into the forest. Our feet brushed against the tall grass, and I was thankful that I wore pants. It may be hot outside, but I'd take that over having my legs itch from the irritation caused by nature. Chuck turned to me again and asked, "So how far back do we need to go?" "I haven't been here in a while. The forest has really overgrown since the last time I was." "So you're saying we're lost already?" asked Chuck, smiling like a moron. "No, I'm saying I haven't seen the remnants of the 2 tracks yet. So when I do, we will set up camp nearby. Well, you let me know when you've had enough. I don't know about you, but just being out here even during the day gives me the creeps," said Chuck, visibly shuddering. I was surprised that he felt that way. After how he'd been teasing me, I only grunted in acknowledgement, like I had heard him but didn't feel like verbally responding. We continued to walk until we came upon a small area where it looked like the grass had been struggling to grow. This had to be it. It was clearly different from anything else around us, and the area itself was without trees in a more or less straight line. "I think this is it," I said, pointing to the ground in front of us. "Where are we setting up?" asked Chuck, already removing his backpack from his shoulders. I looked around and noticed a slope-like area that would keep us obscured from the 2-track path. "Down there," I said while gesturing towards the slope with my head. "If you say so," retorted Chuck as he began traipsing down the hill to the base of the slope. It wasn't insurmountably deep, and there was a flat area that butted up against the slope, so it worked out for us. I started setting up my tent, and Chuck did the same. We had to help each other because they weren't the easy to set up kind. And when we were done, we made a small fire pit. I checked my phone. No signal. "Yeah, that's not going to work," Chuck said, stating the obvious as he motioned to my phone. "I know. I was only looking at the time," I said, stuffing my phone back in my pocket. Well, what are we going to do while we wait?" asked Chuck, reading my bored mind. "We could walk the trail back to where Darcy's friends were partying." "Sure," he said quickly, and we both rose to our feet with a grunt and climbed up the slope to walk the grassy trail. I was already feeling uneasy. I couldn't even begin to imagine the way my nerves would feel if I actually saw Darcy walking this very same trail later tonight. I was glad I had my brother with me because I don't think I could do any of this alone. Being lost in deep thought has its negative consequences. Chuck's voice being one of those abruptly intrusive consequences that startled me when he spoke. "So, what's the point of all this?" "Just curiosity, I guess. I've never seen a ghost before, Percy, so I just want to see if it's true." "And after that?" he asked inquisitively. "I don't know. I'll figure that out tomorrow," I sharply responded. Sometimes I just wanted to walk quietly, with only the sounds of insects and the wind as company. I enjoyed my brother's presence, but only when he wasn't speaking. Suddenly, Chuck stopped me and held his finger to his lips. "What?" I whispered. "Shoo. Can you hear that? I think it's gurgling." Then he started to laugh, and a scowl spread across my face. "Lighten up, brother. I'm just messing with you. It's not funny. It may be if we weren't deep in the middle of a potentially haunted forest." I sighed deeply. "I'm just on edge." "Relax, man. Look there." Chuck pointed ahead of us to an area that appeared to be an opening of sorts. "That's probably where the party was." I nodded and proceeded to walk with him into the clearing. I was surprised to see that there were still empty cans and other pieces of trash scattered about the overgrowth. It was like the party only ended yesterday, but the deterioration of the items in question showed the opposite, as the labels were mostly faded, and it was clear nobody had been out here in a long time. "Whoa, is that blood?" exclaimed Chuck while reaching towards a stain on a rather large stone that jutted out of the ground. "Don't touch that, dude. What's wrong with you?" I asked, pulling his hand away. "What can I say? I'm a born explorer," I mumbled under my breath. "More like a born idiot." I studied the stain closely, without touching it. Sure enough, it definitely appeared to be dried blood. The stuff never goes away without a vigorous cleaning, and I doubt anyone bothered to do that out here. One thing's for certain, there had to have been an accident for blood to be here. The question is, what kind of accident? That blood could be from anything, man. Hell, who's to say it's not recent? While I loathed the thought, he was right. I was only assuming it was old, but it could have been fresh, relatively speaking. "You're right, but just don't touch it, please." "Sure thing," he said in a surprising response that I didn't expect. We spent most of the day perusing the site of the party and reminiscing on the past. We discussed the happenings of Darcy's incident and the thoughts of her friends upon learning about what occurred. Nobody could have been prepared for something like that, and the man who ran her over was none the wiser until he reached the party site and started complaining about why he wasn't invited. The group asked if he had seen Darcy on his way up, and he said that he hadn't. After a short while, some of her friends grew worried and ran down the trail searching for her, only to find a bloody former version of their once lively friend. And as I stated earlier, the only thing she said was of how her bones hurt. Quite ominous last words, if you ask me. The guy was charged with involuntary manslaughter and sent to prison. Despite his speed, the damage done to his truck should have been enough for him to realize he had hit something on his way into the forest, and that's what got him convicted. Chuck tossed a can at my head, and it brought me out of my deep contemplation. "Hey, fuck you," I said, mildly agitated. "When will you learn to live a little?" he asked with another dumb guy smile on his face. "Leave my personality be and let's head back to the campsite. It's starting to get late now and I'm hungry." "That's the best thing you've suggested all day," happily exclaimed Chuck. "I'm starving," he added hurriedly. We walked back to the campsite, and the first thing I noticed was a strange matted down area of grass in the center of the two tracks. For whatever reason, I brushed it off as just an area where an animal had laid before carefully climbing back down the slope to our tents. I had brought hot dogs and other camping food like marshmallows and chocolate. The whole 9 yards, you could say. Chuck started cooking the hot dogs over the fire, and I prepared the condiments and buns, etc. We ate quietly and enjoyed the silence of the forest aside from the bird songs that were quickly growing absent as the day pressed on. Before we knew it, night had fallen and all sounds had been replaced with the chirping of crickets and all manner of eerie noises like branches snapping and leaves rustling. Chuck looked at me from the other side of the fire. "So when is she supposed to appear?" I couldn't really figure that one out. "I assume it'll be at midnight." Why I assume that, I don't know. Just seems like the appropriate time, I said while twiddling my thumbs. "I see. I guess we just wait then," he asked quietly. "I suppose so," I said as I listened to the fire crackling and watched the flames dance wildly. The more I thought about what we were doing, the more I began to feel unnerved. What if we did see Darcy wandering the trail? What would we do? Should we try to talk to her? So many thoughts were running rampant in my mind. We waited for a long time, longer than I thought we would, and nothing seemed to be happening. At one point, I thought I saw something peeking out at us from behind a tree, but Chuck said it was probably just my imagination. Eventually, it got to a point where we figured the whole thing was a bust. Nothing was happening, and we were both getting tired. So I told Chuck I'd stay up a little longer if he wanted to go to bed, and he agreed. After he crawled into his tent, I sat out by the fire for another 30 minutes or so, dozing in and out of sleep right where I was sitting. Finally, I decided to turn in. While the whole experience was a little creepy and unsettling, it wasn't what I hoped, so I just wanted to get the night over with and go home the next day. That's when a new sound broke through the rest. It was quiet at first, like a cat walking amongst reeds. Then I put two and two together and realized it was the sound of walking, the sound of bare feet against the grass. The fire was almost out, so it was darker than it had ever been, and I sat still listening to the staggered pattern of footsteps I was hearing. My jaw clenched tightly as I wondered if I should peer over the top of the slope at the path. It had to be her, and this was what we came here for. The steps were so soft but awkward. They sounded like thud, 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 thud. I turned my ear in the direction of the footsteps, and they sounded like they were coming from the party site. But the sound that came next should have been enough to send me sprinting out of the forest. Between another awkward set of footsteps, I heard gurgling, like if someone was blowing bubbles into a thick liquid. If that wasn't bad enough, a low groan followed the gurgling, almost like a zombie in a cheap horror movie. My instincts forced me to wake Chuck up. He was pissed, of course, but when I shushed him and pointed up towards the path, he knew what I meant right away. The gurgling continued. It was a horrible sound, and it was getting closer as the steps were getting louder. Grotesque and haunting noises of bones rattling and joints cracking were coming from somewhere along the path. "What do we do?" whispered Chuck. I could barely see the whites of his eyes. "Be quiet. I'm gonna take a peek," I said before lifting my head just over the crest of the grassy slope we were camped at the base of. I looked left and right but couldn't see anything at first, but then I heard a snap of a twig from up the trail. Like a dull yellow shadow, I saw a figure shambling in our direction. The light from the fire was completely gone now, so the only light was coming from the faded moon, and the form of whatever was coming our way was barely visible. The gurgling continued, followed by more moaning and strained groaning. Chuck elbowed me. "What the fuck, dude? Is that her?" I squinted my eyes. To me, it looked more like the living dead. I couldn't decide if that was more terrifying or not. Whatever it was moving slowly, wheezing and whining, and the gurgling was atrocious and horrendous. But it only got worse the closer it got. Chuck gripped my shoulder lightly at first, but then harder before whispering again. "It's saying something, bro, listen." He was right. When I focused really hard in its direction, I could hear a faint voice that was guttural and muffled. "B-Bones. H hurt." I turned to Chuck. "That's what she was rumored to have said right before she died. That has to be her." He nodded, and we maintained a level of silence so as not to disturb her or grasp her attention. My heart was pounding like a jackhammer, and I was beginning to tremble. The closer she got, the more my eyes adjusted to the darkness, which meant the more of her I could see. The yellow dress she wore was covered in blood from the throat down, and it appeared that her arms were dangling as if barely hanging by a thread of sinew. As she walked, or rather, shuffled further down the trail, it became more apparent as to the damage her body suffered from being run over. I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw that one of her ankles was nearly separated, meaning her foot was dragging against the ground. Then she said in her raspy, gurgling voice, "B-Bones. H hurt." This time, though, I was able to see the blood bubbling out of her throat as she spoke. It spilled out like a clogged drain, spurting in darkened intervals each time she repeated her dying phrase. Chuck turned his head slowly to look at me as she was nearly at the point of the trail where our camp lied. "What do we do?" he asked in the quietest voice he could manage. I held my hand low and motioned for him to keep it down. If I'm being honest, I didn't know what to do. I was more in awe of what I was seeing. However, it was a mistake to look in his direction, because when I looked back, she was staring straight at us. My body turned to stone, and Chuck noticed it at the same time I did. We both were still and as silent as humanly possible. It was at this time that I could hear her strained breathing, like someone whose head was half underwater. Her wretched appearance caused great pain in my heart for what she had gone through, but that thought swiftly left my mind the moment she began taking steps in our direction. Chuck and I stared intently at her, and I knew he was thinking the same thing I was. Do we need to run, or will this apparition simply cease to exist the moment she reaches us? I didn't know if I wanted to wait and find out, because her decrepit form was abysmally terrifying, like something you'd read about in a book of scary stories. Still, neither of us moved. We sat frozen in the grass and watched while her corpse approached us, for what reason I did not know. I could hardly stand being in her presence. It was starting to feel real, like she was more than just a spirit. Chuck slowly moved his hand down to mine and gripped it tightly, and Darcy, or the spirit of Darcy, responded by stopping her advance and turning to face him directly. "B-Bones. H hurt," she said again in her ominous and hoarse voice. Then, she abruptly turned around and continued walking down the path. When she had gained quite a distance from us, Chuck looked at me with intensely frightful eyes. "I want to get out of here," he said with a shakiness in his voice. Then, his eyes widened and he shouted, "Oh fuck dude, she's coming back." I looked and saw something I never thought I'd see in my life. She was floating about an inch above the ground and her head was rolling around like it didn't belong on her shoulders, and she was moving fast. I turned to Chuck and said, "Fucking run, dude." We both took off into the forest, running in roughly the same direction, and I was smacking into trees and tripping over things, but luckily nothing too serious. I remember stopping to turn around and see if she was still behind us, and much to my dismay she was. Obstacles meant nothing to her as she followed us quickly and with great ease. She was screaming, "Bones hurt," and the aftertone of gurgling blood made her sound like a drowning demon. Chuck and I both continued to run, and when we had gotten far enough away to where her screaming had faded, we stopped to rest. "What in the actual fuck?" he said through deep and heavy breaths. "Your guess is as good as mine, dude," I said back through equally strained breathing. "Don't shout," he said through a harsh whisper. "She'll hear you." "Right, sorry." I peered out from around the tree I was hiding behind and surveyed as much of the immediate forest as I was able to see. As far as I was concerned, the coast was clear. "What do we do?" I asked Chuck calmly. "We need to get back to the car," he said as he smacked a mosquito on his arm. "Okay, you're right. Let's start walking back, and if something happens, just agree to meet at the car." "All right, deal," he agreed while nervously looking around. We found the trail again. Oddly enough, it was much closer than I thought. I figured we had run a mile away at least, but there was still no sign of Darcy, so we kept walking with every step and sound putting us on edge. A twig snapped behind us and we spun around, but nothing was there. Chuck grinned worriedly before it turned to something completely different. "What's wrong?" I asked, still remaining quiet. "Look," he said, pointing to the side of the path. There, in the direction of his finger, was our campsite. We hadn't moved at all. "I'm starting to freak out, dude," he said as I watched his finger shake uncontrollably. "Listen, we just need to keep going." What's wrong?" he asked after noticing my voice trailing off. I pointed down the trail towards the party site, and Chuck's gaze followed the length of my finger until it met what had me at a loss for words. Darcy was coming right for us. "Run!" shouted Chuck, and I didn't hesitate. Once again, we sprinted away from her malevolent spirit and ran like the wind through the shadowy forest. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, there she was, hovering like a possessed puppet, gurgling about her bones. There was a certain absence about our running, and it was then that I noticed Chuck was gone. When I spun around, Darcy was gone as well. I heard a blood-curdling scream from somewhere deep in the forest, but I couldn't tell if it was him or not. It sounded tortured, but he must have just gotten lost, and that meant I had to get to the car. I continued to run with barely enough energy to keep going, and finally I came out of the forest and ran across the road to my car. I fumbled with my keys and crawled inside before slamming the door and locking them. Chuck wasn't with the car. Where is he? It's been several hours since I lost sight of my brother. I'm writing this now because I have cell service, but I just don't know what to do. There has been no sign of him. But wouldn't it be better to search for him in the day? Should I call the police? Someone please help me. I didn't think a ghost could ever do something like this. Wait, I just looked in the rearview mirror. I can see something dull and yellow at the forest's edge on the other side of the road. It's getting closer. There's only 5 of us on this camping trip. We keep counting 6. There were bright flashes of red in the sky. It's as if someone was waving around a flare light from space, faint but noticeable. We all made UFO jokes and laughed as we nailed our tents into the ground. I knew for sure that there were 5 of us. We have all been friends since early middle school, and we're celebrating our high school graduation with this getaway camping trip. The flashes of red must have stopped randomly as we made conversation while fixing up our tents. Dave managed to put his tent together the fastest and told us he was going to find some branches for the fire. I remember how he had worked with me at the local gas station last year. We used to do the night shift together, and it had made working at a desolate gas station much more fun than it was supposed to be. There was also Eric in the corner still reading his tent manual, fidgeting with his signature round glasses. I wasn't as close with Eric as I was with the others, but I still remember sitting with him in math class and copying his homework one time. Ava was also there talking with Sally, my cousin. Both had decided to team up and work on one tent at a time. I also have clear memories of them hanging around at school in our usual places. In fact, I even knew Ava's younger brother, as he used to beg to go with us wherever we went. I bring all this up because I'm sure that there were 5 of us including me, and that I knew everyone in the group. So Dave had went to get some branches as we pulled out some foldable chairs and set them up around the fire pit. I remember feeling uneasy as the sun set and darkness began to consume the forest. The shadows of trees elongated around us as the minutes ticked by. Eric went to get a flashlight from his bag while we wondered what was taking Dave so long. He appeared soon after, the harsh rustling sounds of the bushes signifying his return. We were all buried in our chairs at this point, covered by our jackets. The temperature had dropped quickly and a slight breeze was beginning to pick up. "Geez, you guys weren't even bothered to pull out a chair for me," Dave said as he arranged all the branches in the pit. We had set up 5 chairs around the fire. I tried to rationalize the situation, but no matter how hard I focused, my head felt like it was underwater. I had perfect clarity up until that moment, but when I tried to focus on why 5 chairs were occupied when Dave hadn't sat down yet, my head seemed to just stop working, as if something was reaching in and pulling out my thoughts. Instinctually, I felt even more uneasy now, and I had placed why. The whole forest had gone dead silent. I looked around at the faces of the others and could tell that they had felt the same. Eric was fidgeting with his fingers, trying to scan around the group and spot the extra person, but it was futile. I scanned every face, each etched in worry and frowning in frustration except for, "It's all right, I'll get the chair myself," Dave said, breaking the silence and somewhat alleviating the tension. I got up and offered to help him. He looked into my eyes and nodded knowingly. We headed away from the fire pit towards the tents, but I kept my eyes glued on our group. "How many people are here?" I whispered to Dave as he looked around and realized that we had indeed only packed 5 chairs. In fact, every person had brought with them their own chair. They were heavy to carry, and we wouldn't bring any extra needlessly. "There's 5, right? I mean, there's 5 chairs," Dave replied. His voice wavered as he spoke. "No, I just think maybe one of us forgot our chair," I said. My mind was struggling to address the issue head-on and now sought to find rational excuses instead. I didn't quite feel in control of my thoughts. It felt like swimming in a dream, and if I tried to force myself to think about who the 6th person was, my head would begin to throb. "Yeah, that sounds about right, actually," Dave said, relaxing and heading back to the group. When we walked back to the fire pit and circle of chairs, 2 chairs were empty, one for me and one for Dave. Everything was adding up now, even though we all agreed it wasn't before. Sally suggested we were all probably tired after the long hike to get here and probably just needed some sleep. She could have been right. We were all sleep deprived from waking up very early today to make it on time. Ava brought out the drinks. The whole 6-pack was emptied. We all moved closer to the crackling fire for warmth as we took sips from our cans and reminisced on memories of last year. Ava was in the middle of telling us about that one time she was home alone with weird things happening in her house when I got these sudden chills despite the pleasant warmth of the fire. What felt cozy and safe moments ago felt wrong now, all because I realized that there was a crucial detail I missed. "Who started the fire?" I asked, completely interrupting Ava in the middle of her story and breaking everyone else's immersion. Everyone looked momentarily annoyed until they realized they had no answer. Once again, I scanned the faces staring back at me, all barely illuminated by the light from the fire, all familiar and pale from fear. "Wasn't it you, Dave?" Eric asked. Dave shook his head. "I think the person standing behind Jenny did it," Sally said, looking over at me. I whipped my head around so quickly it hurt. My heart was pounding in my ears. There was nothing behind me except for the encompassing darkness of the woods. Staring at those tall, dark trees behind me made me feel exposed. I felt like a lost bird in a vast field. Wait, I don't know, Sally said. Her eyes had gone wide and she was shaking visibly. She continued to look around frantically as Ava moved over to her, placing her hands on her shoulders and trying to calm her down. I think we should leave this place, Ava stuttered. Yes, something just doesn't feel right, but I can't put my finger on it, Dave said. But it's so dark out in the forest now. We'd probably get lost if we leave now, someone else said. Yeah, I think we should stay the night and leave as soon as we can tomorrow, Eric agreed. I tried to protest but realized Eric was right. The woods harbored an oppressive darkness within which navigation would be near impossible. Let's not sleep in our separate tents just to be safe, Sally said. We all agreed. We only brought one-person tents with us, but we could squeeze two if we tried. That way no one would be alone at night. Following this conversation, we all got up and made our pairs. I went with Dave and Sally like always went with Ava. Eric kept complaining that he didn't have a pair, but we reassured him he did. He wouldn't accept it. I feel like at some point we all realized that there were only 5 of us and suddenly we were all huddling up in the middle of the clearing. Why do we keep thinking there are 6 of us here? Eric asked. Sweat was dripping down his face despite the cold. We had nearly left him all alone on his own under the assumption that there was another person. My stomach turned as I squeezed my eyes shut and tried to mentally recap everyone here. My head throbbed, but I kept pushing it. There's me, Dave, Eric, Ava, Sally, and... I was pointing at each of them as I said the name. I retched and emptied the contents of my stomach on the ground when I got past Sally. The left side of my head felt like there was a knife stuck in it. My vision was blurry. Dave held me up to stop me from collapsing, and we all wordlessly started to move towards the tents as someone put the fire out. Dave helped me into a tent while the 4 outside discussed what to do. I could only focus on snippets of the conversation as the excruciating pain beating against my skull came and went in waves. Sally had the brilliant idea of arranging 3 tents together so their openings faced together at right angles in a sort of U shape so we could sleep as close as possible and also limit the entrance to our tents. Dave was about to go to help as they worked outside, but I clutched his hand and asked him to stay with me. The tents took some time to arrange. I started to feel a bit better once everyone got settled into their tents. A quick head count confirmed there were 5 of us. Eric would have to sleep in his tent alone, but he was more comfortable with it since all the tents were very close now. Looking back now, I think he was just trying to put a brave face on for us. I regret that moment deeply, letting him sleep in his tent alone. He was always less integrated in our group and knew that none of us would pair with him. Just before going to bed, we all agreed to leave as soon as the sun rose in the morning. I remember taking one last look outside the tent into the forest before trying to fall asleep. The wind had picked up and the tree branches were swaying gently. Beyond our clearing was just pure darkness. It felt like the trees were closing in on me, with the faint moonlight illuminating our clearing. I turned my head to look over at the 2 tents we had left out and saw someone standing next to them. Despite the circumstances, sleep came quickly and easily. Ava's shrill scream woke me up in the middle of the night. Dave and I ripped our tent door open to find Sally and Ava looking into Eric's tent. We pushed them aside. Eric's sleeping bag was rolled up. He was still inside it, his head in the center, face contorted in utter agony. The rest of his body rolled around it with the blue fabric now dripping with dark blood. Dave zipped up the door of the tent. Ava was in shock. Her eyes had become glassy and unfocused. Sally was shaking her repeatedly, tears streaming down her face. Dave picked up his torch and yelled at us to get up and run. We left the campsite behind and entered the trail we had come from. The 5 of us huddled together, Dave leading in the front as he cast his weak flashlight over the path so we could see it. All we had to help us get through this 2-hour trail was a small white circle of light. Even the moon failed to illuminate our surroundings through the dense foliage. Ava tripped and fell, twisting her ankle. We came to a stop. Someone said they knew how to splint it so we could keep going. They dragged her into the woods instead. It happened too quickly for any of us to process. Sally was about to run after Ava when Dave held her back. She struggled and managed to free herself, running into the trees to follow the echoes of Ava's screams. I was about to run after her, but Dave held me by the shoulders and shook me hard. "We need to get out of here, Jenny. Please," he said. I hesitated but jolted into motion again when Sally's voice was cut off abruptly. She had been calling out Ava's name as she ran after her. Dave and I continued to run down the trail, trying to get to our car so we could get out of here. There was nothing we could do. At some point, there were 3 of us running on the trail. Dave and I shoulder to shoulder while someone followed us closely behind. "Dave, who's behind us?" I gasped. My heart was threatening to burst through my ribcage and my legs burned. He turned to look at me. Confusion transformed into fear on his face and then into rage. "You keep running," he told me as he produced a pocket knife from his pants. He handed me the car keys, which I nearly dropped. Then he turned around suddenly and jumped at whoever was behind us. I continued to run in fear as the sounds of a struggle grew behind me. I tripped and tumbled through the trail for what felt like hours. I didn't allow myself to stop. I almost cried when the trail ended and I walked out into the familiar car park. Not wasting a second, I ran to the car and started it up, accelerating out of that forest and onto the highway within mere seconds.